Bowinn Ma, thank you so much for taking time to talk about the pandemic and what it means for democracy in British Columbia. You are a legislator, MLA North Vancouver Lonsdale, neighboring riding, yes, from mine. And I guess, so as we look at the upheaval that British Columbians are going through, there are some things that are working, right? Like we're seeing BC right now is the only province that's posting a downward trend in terms of infection rates and fatalities so far. So I guess what I'd like to start with is what's working when you look at our situation. What's working?
Yeah, I mean, well, first off, I think you're right. There is reason to be cautiously optimistic about where BC is headed in its response to COVID-19, but it is not time for us to take our foot off the gas. And that's really, really, really important for us to say time and time and time again, because I think that sometimes when we start to see that curve flattening, and we've been talking about flattening the curve for so long, that when we start to see it happening, we're thinking, oh, everything is fine. Maybe I can go back to my daily life the way that it was before. And we really can't yet. We need to keep the foot on the gas to get us through this. And when you're talking about doing things right, I think that a lot of things are happening in BC that allow us to see some of the trends that I would call that would allow us to be cautiously optimistic. And one of the most important things that is happening is that the vast majority of people in British Columbia have decided that this isn't about each of us as individuals, but about us as a whole. So when I follow the rules, it's not so much about keeping myself safe as much as it is about keeping safe the people that we love and care for, about our neighbors and our elders, and people that we don't even know. It's not about me, it's about us. And that's how we will get through this. And I would say that really is the fundamental core value that is helping British Columbia during this time.
Yeah, that actually does keeping others safe. So about 10 kilometers from where I am, maybe about the same distance from where you are, Lynn Valley Care Centre at the beginning of the pandemic in BC, where that care center was leading Canada tragically in fatalities. Yeah. And that was a reality check for me in terms of how my behavior puts at risk very vulnerable people. So what are your thoughts about that our community actually for a time was leading Canada in terms of fatalities for COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, we are exceptionally fortunate here in Canada to have a universal healthcare system. And that is a lot more than can be said for our neighbors down south, where people are actively debating between being treated for this life-threatening illness and not going bankrupt. And it's really heartbreaking to read those kinds of stories where people who desperately need treatment are pleading and asking who's going to pay for it as they're being put onto a ventilator that they critically need. So I want to emphasize that I'm really enormously grateful for what we have here. But you also brought up long-term care homes. And I remember you asking me this question once, were we prepared for this pandemic? And I would say, first off, I don't think anywhere in the world was prepared for this pandemic. But I also wonder whether or not our healthcare system could have been stronger prior to coming into this. So, I mean, what we saw out at the Lynn Valley Care Centre was indicative of a long-term care system that had been broken down over the last decade and a half. Yeah. I don't know. What do you think about the work that's out there?
Well, yeah, actually,
sorry, I've got my cat here.
You're making me think of the American philosopher Elizabeth Anderson, and her groundbreaking theory is that we have to stop thinking about inequality as being natural, as being a given. Really, it seems so obvious, but she says, and she's right, that when you look at the ways that inequality exists in our culture, it is man-made. It is made by decisions that people make. It is made by economic decisions, made by political decisions, social decisions. And we are coming out of a period where the bottom line wasn't ending inequality. The bottom line was maximizing the profits for a certain group of people, right? So that's what I think. And I think it's bigger than the healthcare sector.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. It is absolutely bigger than the healthcare sector. And what you're talking right now really is the neoliberalization of our society, our economy, our politics. And we see it really strongly we can see how this works in the healthcare system because we're dealing with a pandemic, a healthcare crisis. As you were talking, it reminded me, for instance, of, I'm going to talk a little bit right now about Bill 29 and Bill 94. Okay, because you brought up the Lynn Valley Care Center, you brought up long-term care, you brought up inequality, and we had been talking about the importance of putting the society as a whole ahead of ourselves as individuals. And you're right that for a while, maybe across the world, but certainly here in BC, there was a time when profits were seen as more important than people. And keeping costs low was seen as more important than ensuring greater equality amongst people. So in the early 2000s, there were two bills that were brought forward by the government of the day, and they were known as Bill 29 and Bill 94. And they aimed to make it cheaper for health employers and social service agencies to deliver services to the public. But it did this by making it possible to substantially reduce wages and enable the privatization of essential non-clinical healthcare services like cleaners, food service workers, and care aides. So what those two bills did was they made it easier to contract out services to companies, to privatize healthcare services, and removed provisions that protected workers who were laid off. So I've spoken with countless members of the public who were impacted by these bills, and the stories are absolutely heartbreaking. People remember when the bills were passed and all of a sudden half of the sector was laid off in what Minister of Health Adrian Dix describes as the single largest mass layoff of women, largely women of color, in Canadian history. Wow. Thousands and thousands and thousands of women laid off. And people remember when they survived. Some of them survived those layoffs, but had their work contracted out to a private company who then stripped them all of their union contracts and dropped their wages down by 50% to a couple of dollars above minimum wage. Thousands and thousands and thousands of workers who went from having one or two family supporting jobs to needing to hold 2, 3, 4, or 5 different gigs to get the hours that they need at the wages that they were receiving in order to make ends meet. And we saw how this has severely hampered our ability to actually control transmission of COVID-19 during the pandemic. One of the major challenges that we've had is that transmission of COVID-19 was happening between healthcare, long-term care centers, in part because a lot of these workers worked multiple centers and they might have carried it between them. And one of the things that Minister of Health Adrian Dix has done right now in order to help improve that situation is to require that all workers work at only one facility. But in order to do that, they need to be compensated and they have to be enabled to actually hold only one job. And that was something that Bill 29 and 94 made it nearly impossible for these workers to do prior to the pandemic. And it made it nearly impossible for unions who were trying to support these workers to resist against the cascading privatization throughout the sector. So long-term care homes were bought up by foreign-owned for-profit operators who maybe did not have a stake in the lives of British Columbians. Hospital sanitation workers were making minimum wage while being tasked with an impossible amount of cleaning. Care aides with 30 years of experience, their wages were cut down from $30 an hour to $12 an hour in an instant. And all of their benefits were stripped away. All of this happened in the early 2000s and has been going in that direction up until very recently. So I had hospital workers who told me that their job had gone through 3 contract flips in 6 months. You have to imagine the stress on a family to be constantly laid off, not knowing if you'd be rehired, not knowing at what wage. And every time they attempted to unionize and rebuild their collective power, their contracts would be flipped and they'd have to start all over again. And the consequences of this are very real. We already talked about one example that we've seen during COVID-19, but you have to think also, even outside of a pandemic, do you want your hospitals cleaned by people who care about their jobs, or someone making next to nothing who is exhausted from working all of the other jobs and not being given enough resources to clean the hospital? Do you want your family member cared for by someone who goes to their job every day feeling respected and cared for themselves, or a care aide who has to work at multiple facilities, rushing between them on the bus just to put food on the table? And I remember listening to the story of a Red Seal chef who used to work in a long-term care home, who described cooking with only fresh ingredients back in the 1990s. Sunday dinners, he described it very clearly. Sunday dinners would be prime rib roast with fresh vegetables, fluffy mashed potatoes, and a homemade pie.
That's an Easter dinner.
And that was like a regular Sunday dinner at these long-term care homes for this particular Red Seal chef. And then came Bill 29 and 94. He lost half his crew, had his wages cut by 60%, and spent the rest of his career making Sunday dinners out of microwaved, prepackaged meatloaf, pouring vegetables out of a can, squeezing brown sauce out of a bag, and turning over fruit cups into bowls for dessert. And that's how stark the difference was in a healthcare system before and after the neoliberalization of what should have been treated as Canada's crown jewel of a social program. And that's what happens when you insert a profit motive into a service where the only want is, where the only way to make a profit is to cut back costs by cutting back frontline wages. And so now we see some of the inequality that has resulted from that. These essential care workers, a lot of people often think of nurses and doctors, and they are absolutely essential, but a lot of our essential workers during this pandemic are some of the lowest paid, least respected workers in our society. Not just the care aides, not just the sanitation workers or food service workers, but grocery store clerks and like janitors who clean the elevators in our condos, and drivers, delivery drivers. How many of us are depending on Amazon and grocery delivery service and restaurant delivery service? Like, some of these workers are the lowest paid people in our society. And even in the pandemic, when we have the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, also known as the CERB, that's a lifeline for a lot of people right now. You get $2,000 a month to help cover your costs if you've lost your job. But what if you are a low wage worker making minimum wage, working 4 or 5 jobs, and you've only lost 3 or 4 of those jobs, but not all of them?
Right.
For now, and I'm hoping this changes, but right now, those workers would be ineligible for the CERB, even though they're continuing to work and are probably making less than $2,000 a month. So it's, I mean, when we kind of see where we've come through this pandemic and we see where we started off on, it becomes quite clear where a lot of where we needed to do better to begin with, because social programs and strong social safety nets shouldn't be created in 2 weeks' time during a pandemic. It needs to be there all of the time. And we're seeing the gaps. We're working on the gaps, absolutely. I think all of the governments across the country are coming together and working on these gaps together. But it would have been much more ideal if we had had those in place to begin with.
Yeah. And so it's a virus, a coronavirus, that has caused us, that was our reality check. It's the coronavirus that has caused us to recognize how we have actually put each other at profound risk through neoliberal policies like the ones you described. Treating labor as expendable is to treat people as expendable.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And
sorry.
Please go ahead.
Well, I think about we don't, and for privacy reasons, we ought never to. I don't think know what the vectors were for transmission in the care homes, but certainly to have labor in a situation where they have to work at multiple sites. But I think as well of the homes of these workers, right? Because they're working most likely without personal protective equipment. They go home to families where they might have seniors in their own households. And so we don't know that part of the story about how, just from the perspective of the virus itself, it put their families at risk, as well as the people they were caring for.
Yeah.
And so I think that shows how profoundly dehumanizing the political economy of this has been. But now we're in a situation where, and I know that this was part of your election platform to move BC to a $400 a month rental subsidy. But hey, last Thursday, was it? Boom, the Premier says, guess what? It's live now, and it's $500 a month if you qualify. And so that's 500,000 households, I think, in BC who potentially could be eligible for it. We now have, because of unprecedented collaboration between the City of Vancouver, the province of British Columbia, and the federal government, safe drug supply, at least in the downtown east side. And I think it was on Friday that the Premier and the Minister for Mental Health and Addictions, Judy Darcy, announced province-wide, a teledelivered mental health care service. These are massive social policies that have been brought into place within the space of weeks. So how does that happen then? How does that happen that the government of British Columbia is not a small operation, right? How does it happen that the government can, recognize and reversing the legislation? Now, this happened before the pandemic hit, but reversing Bill 29 and Bill 94. You did that, I think, last year.
2018, yeah.
Okay, year before last. So how does that work then, from your perspective as a legislator, that we can see government move at lightning speed in the housing crisis, the drug crisis, mental health crisis, and you take action?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we've been, our government, when we formed in 2017, we started taking off really quickly. We started making a lot of changes really, really quickly, but none of those changes have happened nearly as fast as in the last 2 or 3 weeks during the state of emergency. And there are a few reasons I think that we can thank for that. One is that there is unprecedented cooperation between MLAs of all political parties, unprecedented. And I have to tip my hat off to all of my BC Liberal colleagues, all the BC Green colleagues, and the independent MLAs as well. We could not have made these changes as a government as quickly and as decisively if we were not all on the same page with the opposition parties, especially in a minority situation, because you have to remember we're also in a minority government.
Yeah.
And minority governments are usually seen as governments that can't get anything done, and yet we're proving that wrong every single day, and certainly during this pandemic. Now, don't get me wrong, though, because opposition parties play a very valuable role in our parliamentary system. It is important for there to be objection from opposite members opposite. It's important for them to be constantly pushing government to be better, to be poking holes into the policies that they're bringing forward. But it's been extremely valuable during this particular crisis for all of us to kind of set aside some of the more petty political differences that might exist between our parties to get things done for people, because lives are at stake, and because we know that even though the numbers, like some people might objectively look at the numbers of positive cases and of deaths and wonder what the big deal is, but we know that this is just the beginning of what could be an avalanche for us to deal with. And so it was important for us to all get on the same page in the front. But it's also, I mean, during this crisis situation, BC is also performing very well due to general political leadership. I mean, we've got a steady but fierce and passionate advocate in Premier John Horgan. And when I say advocate, of course, he's also leading the province, but he's advocating with the federal government. There's a lot of cooperation there between all of the provinces. We're very fortunate to have a strong science-based leadership from our provincial health officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, and Adrian Dix, Minister of Health Adrian Dix, and a selfless team-based attitude by all MLAs from all across the board. But again, even without all of that, the most important thing that we have in BC is that the vast majority of people have decided it's not about me as an individual, it's about all of us. And that underscores everything. And honestly, BC is acting, right? We're acting quickly to the best of our ability, given the unprecedented nature of it all, and we're being willing to adjust and move on if changes are needed. Being decisive is important during these times. So I think that it's happening quickly because we're all coming together. That's really the bottom line of it all. The checks and balances are still in place to the best extent possible. The opposition party members are still participating in those conversations. And like I saw that Norm Letnick, who's the health critic for the BC Liberal Party, led a town hall with government officials. Like, everyone is working together and putting aside their partisan differences, and that is a huge, huge part of the reason why we're succeeding here in BC.
Yeah.
So far, cautiously optimistic.
Well, yeah. So that really does show that again, this virus has called us to pay attention to the necessity of identifying and serving the common good if we're to have a democracy, right? If we don't, people die, and we are seeing that as well in the data that's slowly emerging from the United States. The request from researchers there has been, show us the data in terms of how the COVID virus affects people depending on race. And so far, what I understand is that the jurisdictions, the health authorities there, the political authorities there are very slow to release those numbers. But there are researchers who have identified that, in fact, if you look at New York City, if you look at New Orleans, if you look at California and Los Angeles, it is African-American families, Latino families, who are posting the highest fatality rates as a result of the virus. And so that's a really shocking, in my view, contradiction in terms of how we're moving forward in British Columbia, and the way you described it, a selfless team-based attitude as compared to the entrenching of, it seems, partisanship, the entrenching of the denial of health data in the United States, to the point where I think some Republican legislators today have tried to condemn Dr. Fauci, the White House advisor on COVID for extremism in terms of shutting down the economy. So what are your thoughts then in terms of how the virus is actually calling us perhaps to pay closer attention to the most vulnerable members of our community, as you're seeing happen with your colleagues in the legislature now?
Yeah, I mean, there are some observations that people have rightly made about how quickly governments around the whole world have addressed this challenge in comparison to other challenges. So, for instance, poverty and the overdose crisis, inequality, where people, simply, die from poverty. I mean, I have a whole list in my head, but I'm having trouble listing them out right now because there are so many. People have observed that if we were willing to make the kinds of changes we are making today to address this pandemic, in order to address climate change, we might actually have already addressed that issue already. There are interesting observations to be made about ailments that predominantly impact vulnerable people and how seriously we take those in comparison to ailments that can impact you regardless of your socioeconomic status.
Right.
I think that's, there might be something for us to learn from all of this.
Yeah. It makes it, I think, all the more urgent for us to see decolonization, reconciliation as part of the process of identifying what the common good looks like
Yes.
in BC. And again, the COVID virus wasn't the first time that in like the past 6 months that all legislators acted as a body. I mean, you passed unanimously UNDRIP in December. I had the privilege of speaking with the Lieutenant Governor on December 4th, and Her Honor said the highlight of her life was to give royal assent to UNDRIP. And I know that you are especially concerned about, because they're in your riding, about the Squamish Nation as well. What's your sense in terms of moving to a new normal, how the passage of UNDRIP can actually help us build more resilient communities together with Indigenous leaders?
I think that when we get to the other side of this pandemic, and we will get through this together one way or another, we're going to find ourselves in a position where we're going to have to rebuild as a society, as a country, and we're going to have to decide as a society, as a country, and certainly as a province, how we move forward and what kind of world we want to build moving forward. And despite the terribleness of this pandemic, and let me be clear, this pandemic is devastating for a lot of people. There's incredible stress and concern for loved ones. People are losing their jobs. People are worried about how to pay their bills. Their health is being compromised. They're fearful for their lives. And if there's any possible way to find hope in what is otherwise a terrible situation, it might be to wonder if there's a once in a century opportunity for us to really set the stage for decades to come, to learn how to move forward in a good way that values a sustainable economy, the earth, and all of the people who live in it. And UNDRIP will no doubt need to be a part of that good way forward. Yeah. There's going to be a lot of damage has been done, not only by this pandemic, but by the way that the direction the world has taken in terms of, neoliberal economic policy over the last many decades. It is my hope that people see the value of a strong social safety net and a strong sense of duty from the public to each other coming out of this.
Yeah, and I think that's crucial, because the temptation is to, in thinking about the common good, just to kind of think about it in terms of an undifferentiated, homogenous community. But I think that the only way for us to do that is to have a real sense of what the common good requires, is to bring a human rights analysis to it.
Absolutely.
To recognize how we are, each of us, made to be unequal in ways that are targeting features of ourselves that we didn't choose, right?
Yeah.
And I think about, they've been on my mind quite a bit, because I have had the opportunity, since we've moved to distance learning, to have one-on-one conversations with students through teleconferencing apps. And notice I didn't do a product placement there. But it's heartbreaking, because when I talk to students who are, let's say, from Taiwan or Malaysia or Singapore, what I find is the language from the president of the United States, to name names, naming this as the China virus, right? What I find is that they have felt the sting of that. That's made them not want to leave their apartments because they don't feel welcome. It's made them kind of inclined to take up, if you will, less space. And so it's another dimension of how the COVID virus intersects with race as a driver of racialization, as a driver of racism. And so could I ask you, in terms of what you observe happening in the community, what are you seeing in terms of that? Are you seeing similar trends, or?
Yeah, I mean, racism and prejudice exists all of the time. And we certainly saw some of it during COVID-19 as well. And I think that you're right to observe that a lot of it has come out up onto the surface, because a lot of the time racism and prejudice it's harder to see. It's much more subtle, although with the election of the US president more recently, I think that we've seen a greater trend towards being much more overtly racist. But certainly, I remember in the early days of the spread of the disease worldwide, how areas of Metro Vancouver with large Chinese Canadian populations responded to the stress and the fear of a coming pandemic. For instance, malls across Richmond were empty for weeks before the public health emergency was called in BC. So there were stories of Chinese-owned businesses being collapsed overnight because of rumors spread on social media platforms about there being a person with a virus in their restaurant. And today, now, many businesses have been closed for weeks, but some of these Chinese-owned businesses have been impacted for months already. In fact, I saw a CBC News story just yesterday about a Chinese restaurant, one of many, where the restaurant and the workers were volunteering to create thousands of meals for healthcare workers for free. So an incredible service by restaurants and people who are already struggling financially themselves. And it was posted by the CBC on Twitter. And the first two comments on the social media thread were, "Don't have the bat soup," and "lock up your pets." This was yesterday. And despite the virus now being within the control of authorities in China, even though the virus is actually now more likely to be found elsewhere in the world, I still occasionally receive messages from people making comments about people who are Chinese or about my own ethnic background.
You do?
Oh, absolutely. On social media, it is not uncommon at all for somebody to, there's one particular user who continues to claim that I work for the Communist Party of China, I guess. I don't know what his grievance is, but he constantly brings up my race. There are other ethnicities being targeted as well, though. And here's the thing that I've observed as well, is that a lot of the racialized comments are also being made by people who share the same ethnicity as the group that they are criticizing. And that's noteworthy because racism is always around us, not only in a pandemic. Mm-hmm. And what I've observed is that's a bit different in the last couple of months, is that the fear of the virus combined with racialized descriptions of that virus, the China virus as an example, has amplified a lot of shame that people feel internally about their own origins. And that is really, truly heartbreaking. And we can't have that, because Canada is wonderful and beautiful because of the diversity of places and experiences that we come from. And that was true before the pandemic. It is true during the pandemic, and it will be true after we get through this together. It has to be.
Mm-hmm. The effect of the racialization of the pandemic is to, and thank you for being so candid, it's to, and thank you for resisting what I'm about to describe, but it's to try to force people to not self-isolate, but to racially isolate, right? To feel cut off from a community of support. And I'm thinking again specifically of my students. And one of the advantages that they have, or ought to feel that they have, is our university, is the university as a community, to recognize that the university will be there, not just Capilano University, but all post-secondary institutions, right, can be there to do more than provide the emergency funding that your government has allowed now for universities to disperse to needy students. So I guess one of the things that I learned from my students this semester has been that there is, though, inequality when you look at students BC-wide. If you go to University of British Columbia, which is the oldest university in British Columbia, arguably the wealthiest university in British Columbia, they do have supports available for students to help them address racism on campus, discrimination on campus, to address experiences of being treated arbitrarily or unfairly through an ombuds office. And so I consider those things as being essential parts of a university being present to the vulnerability of vulnerable members of our campus communities, right? So the question that I kind of have to put to you on behalf of my students is about allowing could the province of British Columbia do to level that playing field? What could the province of British Columbia do you think, to help make sure that if you're a student at Capilano University, for example, you should have the same ombuds protection in terms of administrative fairness of processes, protection against arbitrary exercises of power. You should have the same recourse to anti-discrimination investigations as you would if you were at the University of British Columbia. Because right now, I think really the way my students would describe it is a student is not a student is not a student in BC. Some students are more equal than others, depending on which institution you go to. So what are your thoughts about how BC could help all universities improve their protections against discrimination, improve their duties of fairness through equity offices and ombuds offices?
Yeah, I mean, certainly everyone deserves to be treated fairly and to have their concerns addressed in an equitable way. That is regardless of whether or not you are in a university, a trade school, or if you're working or if you're not working. Like, everybody in BC deserves that. And that's why the BC government brought back the Human Rights Commission for everybody in the province. The Human Rights Commission, this is now the third time that it's been brought in. It was brought in by the government of the day back in the 70s, and then it was taken away in the 80s, and then it was brought in by the government of the day in the 90s, and then it was taken away in the 2000s, and now it's back again.
I'm smiling because you're being scrupulously nonpartisan as you describe that history.
Yeah. Yes, it's the same party that consistently brought it in, and there's the same party that consistently brought it out. It's true. In the interest of working together, I'm just stating the facts about the governance of the day. We're hoping that this is the third and final time and that it stays here. It's been created as a kind of an officer of the legislature. So it's harder to remove. You can't just have a government come in and then take it away. You've got to pass it through the legislature and through an all-party committee, or it's just more difficult when it's an office of the legislature rather than an office of government.
And making it so was one of the key asks that my students and I brought to you. So thank you for getting that done.
That's right. So I think that is a hugely important part of making sure that people are treated equitably across the province. But in terms of specific, because you asked specifically about ombuds offices within universities, and my understanding is that actually most of the ombuds offices have been started by students organizing and advocating for them within their institution, which also leads us to basically mention again the importance of that collective action, the importance of working together and organizing together to try to push back against inequitable situations. Like if everyone stands together, it's a lot harder to tear down everyone all at once than it is to tear down a single individual. So I would encourage students to make their voices heard at each of these institutions. Now, each of these institutions, they do have quite a lot of independence and agency from government to operate, and that's for good reason. Yeah. Although there have been cases of governments introducing standards that they require all their post-secondary institutions to meet. So for instance, the requirement to have a sexual assault and sexual violence policy. So there are opportunities there, and certainly I invite students to come and speak with me and their own MLAs if there's something that if there's a province-wide policy that they would like to advocate for, because certainly students have successfully advocated for province-wide policies to be brought in.
Right. And you're going through a budget consultation process now, right? So approach that people can actually put forward recommendations through you to the Finance Committee, or?
I don't know if it's currently right now because we've been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, but there is one every year. Sorry, I'm trying to move around here because I've got lights on my face. But there is one every year, and I don't know the timing of it this year because, again, the physical distancing measures have thrown off a lot of government processes that might normally take place, and it will impact a lot of that work, but it will happen.
Yeah. Okay. So we can maybe just two more questions to round this out. So you are fully invested in getting out there and talking to the community and taking your mobile constituency office around.
Not so much right now.
Not so much right now. So I think one of the advantages of how it's a full send for you in terms of being present in the community is you get then to take back to your constitutionally privileged private deliberations with caucus what you're hearing from in the wider community. So what is your strategy then in terms of keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening? And you are the only government MLA for the North Shore as well, so it's kind of it's bigger than North Vancouver, Lonsdale, you're riding, right? So how are you finding it possible to keep your finger on the pulse of what is happening in our community and represent us to a premier and cabinet who are right now fully invested in making sure that BC succeeds in the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, it's not just me. Even out here on the North Shore, even with opposition MLAs, all of them will also be working to try to keep their finger on the pulse. You're right that in normal situations, I would be out there with my mobile office. I would be knocking on doors. I would be meeting people in the streets and at events. and people would talk to me face to face, and that was an incredibly important part of my ability to stay connected with the community. But everything is different now because I can't do those things without endangering the community that I'm serving.
Yeah.
And so internet and phone and telecommunications is now so incredibly important. And I'm very, very fortunate to have a wonderful, dedicated team, 2 people who work as constituency assistants here on the North Shore. They're working from home, and they help me sort through and answer the literally hundreds of emails that we get from the community every single day. And we're doing our best to answer everybody, but generally speaking, MLAs prioritize members of the community they serve, because, like, as an example, in North Vancouver, Lonsdale, I serve 55,000 people. And I serve 55,000 people with myself and 1.8 full-time staff. So it's important for us to prioritize people in our ridings, as it is important for other MLAs to prioritize them in their ridings. But we're all trying to figure this out. There is a very, very real risk of MLAs and elected officials becoming out of touch with their community, because most of our community is now spending their days inside their private homes, and I cannot go into their private homes to know what it is that their life is like.
You can't knock on doors.
No, we can't. We can call in, certainly, and I do try to do some cold calling with the phone numbers that I have, just to check in with people, to see how they're doing, make sure that they have the information that they have. But you can't really know what's happening in the homes of people and how people are handling this. So we have to do our best in making sure that we're feeding that information to our colleagues. And that's why we have, telecommunications, telehealth, mental health services now for free or low cost across the province. That's why, like, we can also observe from data, right? Taking a very scientific and data-based approach, we know that during the pandemic, calls to victim services for victims of domestic abuse have spiked.
Yeah.
So we know that there are challenges there. We need to try to get information from all of the different sources that we have available to us in order to respond to them, but it is challenging. And I encourage members of the public to keep their MLA involved and engaged by emailing them. Just let them know how things are going. Interact with them on social media. That's what we're here for, really. Yeah.
And again, I mean, the province has brought in measures to strengthen support services for women escaping men's violence, right? But I'll go out on a limb here, and, like, there's always more that needs to be done. And if you or your staff were to get a call from a woman in that situation, my gut feeling is at this time there aren't a lot of resources available for you.
Well, actually, so I think that the interesting thing about this pandemic is that a lot of the things that our government and our political party have supported in bringing in these days, or have always supported in bringing in, we suddenly find that we have the permission, the public permission to do them much more quickly.
Right. So
the system is operating differently now than it normally does, certainly. But so has public attitudes about government. So the basic elements of democracy is still there, and the public will is and always has been a huge part of what gives governments agency to act. And certainly the public's tolerance for decisive action, and for spending is very, very different now than it normally was. So a few days ago, Minister Selina Robinson, who's the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, announced that they had actually secured over 900 new spaces for vulnerable people who need to self-isolate but don't have a place to self-isolate. And
Wow.
some of it also is for women who, and men as well, but generally victims of domestic violence do overwhelmingly tend to be women, to find places for them to be during this time as well. And those new spaces were not just, the floors of community centers. They actually partnered with hotels. So they've secured hundreds and hundreds of empty hotel rooms across the province for this purpose.
Wow.
So there are resources out there. That I would argue there are actually more resources now than there were before the pandemic for people who need help. However, the delivery of them is more challenged. So as an example, shelter space has had to be cut back because they need distance, physical distance between people. So there's a lot being done, but all of a sudden, the circumstances around how we deliver those services are much more challenged, and that also eats into the capacity. It's definitely a bit of a dance that where we and service providers and members of the public are all trying to work through together. Yeah.
And to that, I saw a quick slide today from Abacus data showing that from, I think, the middle of March to today, there's been I think it's a 13% increase in Canadians' level of trust in government, and saying to government, do more of this, that we want you to have our backs. So that's really quite a dramatic shift.
It definitely is. And isn't it interesting how little profits matter when people are not being taken care of, and how little balanced budgets matter when the entire country is suffering? I mean, ideally, a strong public system that includes a robust social safety net is, like I said before, not something you create in 2 weeks' time. It's something that's always there for you when you need it. Unfortunately, the tendency that I've observed here in BC and perhaps everywhere in the world is that when economic conditions are seen as being good, there's a shift towards idealizing the free market where government doesn't regulate anything. And yet, in a crisis situation, we see exactly how important government and thus public regulation of markets and situations is. People organically saw that it was wrong for people to buy up and hoard Lysol wipes and resell them at a huge market. The public organically rose up to condemn profiteering and capitalization of an emergency situation where people's lives were involved. And yet that kind of unrepentant capitalistic behavior is the free, unregulated market that many people, usually right-wing parties, are often so fond of lifting up as the ideal world for us to live in and do commerce in when we're not in a crisis situation. And it's something that people normally praise, but the tolerance that the public has for the consolidation of wealth has drastically changed during this pandemic. And we're seeing what's important, and what's important is people.
And the virus is showing that a neoliberal model is a dangerous delusion, because when push comes to shove, we actually have to find ways to care for each other in the ways that the market cannot do.
It's also interesting to see how large corporations will react in times of crisis like this. When times are good, they expect profits to all be for themselves. These major corporations, they expect, like, when times are good, then I should be able to keep all of the profits for myself and my CEOs, my high-paid executives. But when times are bad, we want the public, we want the government, which is really the public, to bail us out and to cover our costs. I'm primarily commenting on the behavior of major industries and companies down in the States right now. But I will have to also say that lots of companies, at least up here in Canada and in BC, have stepped up to help with the fight in COVID-19. So this isn't a comment, a negative comment on all major corporations and businesses and companies, not at all. What I'm saying is that there is a segment of the population that seems to change their attitude about the socialization of supports.
Yeah.
Between when times are good and they see money flowing in, and when times are bad and they want somebody else to bail them out, rather than maintaining an equitable social structure that helps everybody all of the time.
Mm-hmm. Hot take. Where do you find hope? Where are you seeing hope here? We can end with this.
Yeah, I mean,
where are you finding hope?
Again, I've said, let's be clear, this pandemic is a terrible situation. However, it brings me a lot of hope to see how members of the community are coming together on this, and how they have collectively decided that it is more important for me to change my behavior for a little while to save the people that I love and care about, and to protect people that I don't even know. And I see that hope in the eyes of my neighbors and in people like yourself, Michael, who are continuing to power on through extraordinary times. We know that we have healthcare workers out there who are still working every single day to try to keep us safe. I'm grateful for all of the essential workers like bus drivers and delivery drivers and sanitation workers and grocery store workers. They are warriors in this, and a lot of them are being paid really poorly to do it. But I also find, which is something that we really need to fix over time, by the way. But I also see a hope from just the balconies of my building. On Easter Sunday, I could hear the laughter of children coming from the little yards and the balconies all over the building, because parents are still going the extra mile to keep the magic alive for their kids. And I think there's a lot for us to be hopeful about, even though we're doing it all apart.
Thank you, Bowinn. So next you're going to hear me is at 7:00 tonight when we do our shouting. So you'll hear me all the way from your house.
Oh, that's you. Oh my
That's
goodness.
me.
I was wondering.
That's me.
There's that one person that was really, really, really loud.
Okay, so thank you from the bottom of our hearts. And I am going to protect your privacy now and stop the recording.